All right, everybody. So we've got to finish out this unit by talking about risk control. So up to this point, we've been talking about insurance as the technique to handle risk. And yeah, there's a lot of cases where that makes perfect sense. But you're not done just because you bought insurance. And so we're going to specifically talk about ways you can reduce your property exposure and ways you can reduce your liability exposure. 1 second here. Sorry about that. 'Tis the season of packages. Anyway, so we need to talk about the idea of how do you reduce your property exposure beyond just buying insurance, and how do you reduce your liability exposure beyond just saying, well, if it happens, we'll pay for that through insurance by financing it. So it's the way to think about it. Let me go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. The way to think about it is you really have two main things you can do to deal with risk. One is to pay for it. And so there you're just talking about, do you retain the risk or do you insure against it? So small things, frequent things, yeah, you're retaining those. Big things that could put you out of business that are hopefully infrequent, those things you have to insure. And then we've got the idea of, well, what if you can do something about the risk itself? What if you can reduce its frequency or severity? One way to reduce the frequency is avoidance. And we talked about this in the beginning of the class. The problem with avoidance is that doesn't work real well for most risks. If you're worried about the risk of your business not making money, avoidance means you don't go into business. Well, that's not really, risk management that requires me to shut down my main effort. That's probably not optimal, right? So most of the time we spend our time thinking about loss control, actions that we take to reduce frequency or severity of losses. And we did a lot of this in the beginning to try to open people's minds to the idea of there are things we can do beyond insurance. We did that case assignment, and that asked you to think about some of these kinds of things. Now we're going to specifically think about certain actions we can take, and we're going to spend most of our time, believe it or not, on fire. That's a risk that is common, and it's a risk that is easily mitigated in a bunch of different ways. You can never drive it all the way down to zero, but there are certain things that you can do that'll make a big difference. And some of those things are super simple and cheap and easy. And so for those, we for sure want to make sure that we're doing that. And this is why, if I'm an insurance company, I employ loss control specialists that I send out to the businesses that I insure. And they go through and they look at how we operate, and they come back with a list of cheap, easy, simple, recommendations that we can do to make losses less likely. So this risk control area, that's where we're at. Then also, at least in 2020, in this version of the class that I'm teaching, fall of 2020, this is a separate certification you can get just by going through this course and passing it with, in this case, a B- grade or better. Automatically gets you credit for the risk control unit that comes as part of the CPCU designation. So it's worth thinking about this here. Now, I do have to tell you, normally we have a small book that we hand out to everybody. We have enough copies and we just give them to everybody. Online, you're really going to be relying on your notes from here on out because I don't have an easy way to provide that to you. At least not a way that's going to be legal if I'm going to respect copyright and everything. And we need to be able to do that for the institutes and all the help that they've given us. We need to be able to go ahead, move forward. So this material is coming from their publication. I'm not going to ask you to buy it, but I am going to ask you to take exceptionally good notes here, because you're not going to have a book to rely upon for this portion of the class from here on out. So fair warning, now you know. When we think about our exposures, let's remind ourselves where they come from. We have losses to property. And again, insurance seems like the easy way to do it. We've got worst case scenarios that we can imagine. Those are one category of loss exposures. We have liability loss exposures. Again, we have liability insurance to protect against that. There's certain other things we can do. We'll talk about that later. Net income loss exposures. So here we talk about loss exposures from not being able to operate. And business income insurance is a really good way to help us prepare for those kinds of losses. But you know what else is a really good way to prepare for those losses? Not having the loss in the first place. taking some action to make it less likely that you have the fire that shuts down your business for 3 months while you rebuild. That's something that's worth thinking about. Then we also have personnel loss exposures. And ironically, it's the small businesses that face these more so than the big ones. You rely on certain key people. And what if something happens to them, if they become disabled, or if unfortunately they die unexpectedly? Or retirement, usually that's not unexpected. We can, most of the time with retirement, we can plan for this, get some succession planning done in ahead of time. And that's super helpful because then we're mitigating against that risk. So our business doesn't rely on one person. The small business, it's really hard to get around the idea of a key person. In a small business, there's usually one person in charge making decisions that if you lose that person, it's going to be really hard to sustain the operation. So, yep, we can insure against some of these losses. And life insurance helps us with that. There's some creative things we can do on the risk control side too. But most of the time it's ensuring that we're trying to do this. So, okay, you've got somebody whose knowledge and experience is irreplaceable. Well, all right, get a $500,000 life insurance policy on that person. And you'd probably be able to go out and hire somebody to replace that person. If you had that kind of money to do it, you'd probably be able to find somebody who'd be able to handle it. That's usually the thought process here. Personnel loss exposures are really interesting. Sometimes it's even at the lower levels. The bigger companies have gotten into trouble over this. So even at the lowest level, you've got a certain amount of training that you've invested in a person, right? And so if you lose that person after you've trained them, your company does suffer a financial loss when you try to replace them. So some companies buy life insurance on their lower level employees. Where they get into trouble is that a lot of times the employees think that this is life insurance for them. It isn't. This is life insurance to cover if something happens to them, it gets paid to the big company. And so already it sounds a little bit like not something that the average person is going to be comfortable with. And remember, you can't buy life insurance on a person without their permission. So we're getting their permission to buy life insurance, and they're thinking, oh, this is going to go to my family if something happens to me. Nope. It's really to compensate the company for the training investment that they've made in their lower level employees. Well, obviously, you can understand after we lose a lower level employee, the family says, well, how come the company bought life insurance to protect themselves and they didn't do anything to protect us? That just doesn't seem right. I get it. It doesn't seem right. And so a lot of the big companies, after getting publicity like this, the publicity on something like that, it just looks terrible. The optics are terrible. It makes perfect financial sense. But because of how it looks, a lot of the big companies that used to do that have stopped. They said it's not worth the public relations nightmare. So you got a couple different ways you can handle that specific problem, right? I mean, one thing you could do is just not do it. All right, avoid. And then there's no problem. Or you could maybe provide life insurance to the family above and beyond, on top of in bigger amounts of the small amount that you're insuring their life for to protect the company. Maybe you, as an employee benefit, you could voluntarily pay more and make it so their families could receive life insurance coverage. And then that way, at least it's a lot less likely that you're going to have people irate. You could say, yeah, number one, we are terribly sorry that you've lost your family member. That's why we bought a $100,000 life insurance policy to help you. Oh, yes. And by the way, we also bought a $10,000 life insurance policy to help us replace the expertise that person had. Then it doesn't look so bad. When you say, well, no, we only have $10,000 and it comes to us, that's a tougher position to defend in the court of public opinion. But those are personnel loss exposures, even though they're not key person. The idea was, yeah, we have a whole bunch of lower level people and the business isn't critically impacted by the loss of one of them, but our training expenses are. Financially, it makes perfect sense to protect with life insurance, but it creates a bunch of other problems that are foreseeable if you just think about that for a second. And there's things you can do on the loss control side to try to handle those exigencies if they come up. On the property side, so loss prevention, loss reduction, right? Similar, but loss prevention is aimed at reducing the frequency of losses. Loss reduction is aimed at reducing severity. And so when you think about fire, we think about things like what can we do to prevent the likelihood of fire? We'll get into real detailed stuff coming up, but think about where we store our flammable materials. Are they near a heat source? And one thing that's going to come up later, people are always using their furnace rooms for storage, right? Because it makes sense, because in your furnace room, it's just got machinery and equipment and you're not thinking about it. And there's probably a whole lot of empty space. You're like, yeah, we can store stuff there. Well, what you've done, if you've put flammable stuff there near your source of heat, you've increased your fire risk. So how about we don't do that? Or how about if we discover that, we recommend that we stop doing that? Okay, that's a real specific example of loss prevention. Loss reduction is aimed at severity. So now we're thinking about, okay, what if we had sprinklers? That isn't going to prevent the fire from starting. It's going to put out a fire that's already started and has reached a threshold that set off the sprinkler. So it's not going to reduce the number of fires. It's going to reduce the damage from the fire. So sprinklers are pretty clearly loss reduction. It's separation. Where can you separate processes so that you're not so dependent on a single supplier? Maybe that's a good one. Okay, in the propane business, one of our big problems in the winter, this is something that unless you're in the propane business, you have no idea. There are times where the pipeline can only ship so much gas. There's a fixed volume it can ship, right? And obviously when the demand goes up in the winter, during a real cold stretch, they won't have enough gas to satisfy everybody. So what they do at that time is they go on allocation. And the allocation, the amount that you get, is based on how much you've bought from this supplier over the past year. Well, if this is a really, really tricky thing, because your incentive is to buy as much as you can from a single supplier to max out the allocation that you're going to get. If you separate, which is normally a good strategy, you want to buy from a bunch of different suppliers, because when you really need the help, if you are reliant on one supplier and you are in a bind and you really need help, if they can't help you, what are you going to do? You're going to go to one of their competitors and they're going to say, we don't know you. You don't buy from us. Why should we do you a favor? So it's usually a smart idea to have some linkages to multiple suppliers. That's usually the strategy. With propane, you have to weigh that against the idea that if the pipeline goes on to allocation, it's going to be based on how much you bought. So if you bought everything from one supplier, your allocation is going to be pretty big. If you took half of that away and sprinkled it out among 10 different suppliers, you're not going to have very much allocation from any of those suppliers at all. And that's really going to put you in a bind. So that's an idea of where separation can cause you a problem. Most of the time, okay, so I buy from a single supplier. What I'm doing, and we've talked about this before, how we can use business income insurance to cover dependent properties, right? And that was the idea. And in this particular case, we're talking about a supplier. So if I'm dependent on a single supplier, what if they go down? Now I'm down as well. So normally we say, let's separate. Let's have contracts available from 2, 3, 4 suppliers, and then that way, if one of them goes down for a period of time, we can meet our needs from others. It goes against the philosophy of what we call just-in-time manufacturing. That was all the rage when I was in college. Oh, just-in-time inventory control. You time everything so it gets there just in time so that you don't have a ton of money tied up in inventory. It sounds like it makes sense until you find yourself in a bind and there's a disruption in your supply chain. Now it doesn't work. Now you've got enough to handle, the demand for the next week, but after that, you don't have anything coming. And now you got a big problem. So that's a situation where you might want to think about either separation or duplication. Same thing here with duplication. Do we have all our production for our biggest demanded product in a single factory? Okay, if we do, then we are at risk with the idea that if it goes down, our ability to produce that product is completely gone. If you spread that out, if we duplicate that among 2 or 3 processing facilities, that might be a smart decision. These are decisions that have a whole lot of moving parts, right? What's the optimal quantity to produce? You can't violate those ideas. It doesn't make sense to have 3 factories operating at a quarter capacity. Or I guess technically if you got 3, it would have to be a third capacity. If your true capacity is 3 times that, then I don't know that I'd feel excited about investing in 3 factories, now you're triple redundant. Maybe 2 I would be willing to do, but maybe not 3. And these are operational questions, and there's a lot of moving parts. You got a whole nother workforce you got to deal with. You've got a whole nother chain of supervision. It's a big deal. It's a lot bigger than just the risk management part of it, which is to say, hey, are we reliant on a single point of failure here? So separation, duplication, diversification, a lot of times it's hard to distinguish, well, which is which, but they're all kind of getting at the same idea. Are you reliant at any point on a single point of failure? And if that one single point of failure is going to put you down, you might say, all right, the only thing we can do, we can't build 2 factories. We're not even max capacity at the one that we have. It doesn't make sense to build another one. We're just going to have to rely on business interruption and the idea that we could lose customers permanently. And remember, again, you usually can't insure against that. That's just a risk we're going to have to live with. That might be the decision. So yeah, these should always be considered in addition to your primary risk management method, which is probably going to be insurance. On the other hand, if you've thought about these things and you've put them into place, it should make your insurance cheaper. If they realize that, hey, they've already got a backup plan, so loss of business income is, less likely, that should reduce what it costs to buy insurance and make it easier for you to qualify for insurance. That's what that last line says, if you can't quite read that. Reduces insurance cost and makes qualifying for insurance easier. So the first example that they show in this little pamphlet, the addition to the textbook here, talks about the McCormick Place fire. And this is 1967. I know a lot of times you say, gosh, it was a long time ago. Does that really matter anymore? This one was really kind of a watershed because it really changed the way people thought about fire losses, because prior to that time, they said, well, you got a sprinkler system, you got a fire department, what else are you going to do? That should be good enough. What we've discovered here was that there's a whole lot of things that matter. Yeah, I'm going to have you read a separate reading about the McCormick Place fire because it's just so fascinating to look at what happened. So here's the thing. It's a convention hall. This was a crown jewel in Chicago of buildings. It was thought that it was fireproof because it was the building construction. It was thought that this place could never burn. Well, what they found out was that was wrong. And it burned down in the middle of hosting a show. Fortunately, because it happened late at night, injuries and deaths were kept to a minimum, but one person did die. So it was a tragedy with real human consequences. There was blame all around after the fact, of course, when everybody realized, well, what should we have done? They didn't have a sprinkler system. All right. And when you think about fire, when fire has a lot of air, that means it has a lot of oxygen. Oxygen feeds fires. Oxygen is a fuel. We'll talk about this. Huge ceilings. That's fine. But if you got no sprinklers, what are you going to do when the fire is roaring through the air? You got a problem. The fire hydrants, they thought at the time they didn't work. They didn't know this. It turns out that they thought they were frozen because this happened in the winter. I don't remember off the top of my head if it was January or February. But the fire hydrant valves, they wouldn't open. They were frozen shut, and they couldn't thaw them. They couldn't figure out how to open that. And then the firefighters didn't even know where those valves were. So nobody was prepared for this. There weren't enough outlets. This is a common problem. Oh, man, think about this, right? Okay, so when you don't have enough outlets, what do? Well, you get a power strip. Great. And if you still don't have enough outlets, what do? Yeah, people plug the power strip into the other power strip. What you're doing is deliberately overloading a circuit that's not designed to be able to deliver that much electricity safely. What's going to happen is it's going to result in a fire if you do enough of that. And this happens in office places all over the place. This is one of the most common sources of fire that can be completely done away with. If we just tell people ahead of time, please, please, please don't plug outlet strips into one another. And better yet, don't use any outlet strips at all. There's a reason that they're limiting the number of things that you can plug into a specific outlet. And then you know how it goes, right? Oh, the circuit breaker gets tripped. Well, let's tape it down so it can't trip. It's there for a reason. And it's a safety reason. So here, that was part of the source of the fire. That's what they think, is that there weren't enough outlets and too many people chaining surge protectors together. That was a problem. all kinds of problems. Like I said, I'm going to have you read specifically on this case because it's so interesting, because it underlines the value of being able to do some loss control for fire. Because these are simple, cheap, and easy things that we could have done. The firefighters were not familiar with the building. That's a problem. So you've got a couple different approaches you can take. One is the engineering approach in the design of the building. And this is before you actually have a building. We've had enough, some great experience with improving design in, especially in the last, 50 years, but even in the last 200 years, we've come a long way, and we know what works in terms of reducing the possibility of fire. Buildings that are built to the latest and greatest specifications do a really good job at that. That's their engineering. So that's where they're, locating outlets and things like that. And it's built in a way to reduce hazards, So where are we putting our firewalls? It's something that in building design, it's incorporated. The other thing that we have to worry about is human behavior, right? So, all right, we know we don't want people plugging, the extension cords into each other, the outlet strips into each other. We know that's a terrible idea. We know that when a circuit breaker is tripped, we don't want you to find a workaround. It's tripped for a reason, and that means you got too much load on the system. Figure out how to reduce the load on the system. Don't figure out a way to force the circuit breaker to stay open. That's a terrible idea. In the old fuse-based systems, people learn that, oh, hey, you can replace a fuse with a penny. Yeah, you can. And then you've just completely defeated the entire purpose of having a fuse. The fuse isn't there to make it easy for you to operate your electrical system. The fuse is there to give you a warning that you're expecting too much out of certain areas of your electrical system when it blows. And if you're just going to replace your fuses with pennies, you're completely undermining the whole reason for having them in the first place. So it's okay. Talk to your people and your employees. You got to let them know this is why we do it. And that's why we have policies and procedures. And then there has to be some sort of enforcement mechanism. I mean, I remember as a young person, I was 16, and I remember that I was working at a Target, and they had all kinds of policies and procedures and all kinds of, you'll get warned and then you get fired. But some things were so bad that they would fire you immediately if they knew that you did it. One of them was climbing the shelves. So this would always happen to me specifically. I'd work at this camera sound booth. This is in the ancient times where you actually had cameras with film. So you didn't know what your pictures looked like until the film was developed, like weeks later. I know, you can't imagine such a thing. But I'd work in that booth, and somebody would say, oh, I want this model camera. I'd look in the display case. We're out. Let me run to the back and get it. Well, I'm the only person in the booth. So sure enough, every time I go back to the back to look for something, someone's like, how come there's nobody in the booth? There's nobody in the booth. So you had a huge incentive to try to get that stuff done as quickly as possible. And a lot of times the ladders that you're supposed to use are way the heck down at the end of the aisle, and they're heavy and they take time to move. And, in the meantime, I'm getting paged. Yes, paged. Where are you? How come you're not back where you're supposed to be working? And you don't, it's one way. You can only hear what they're saying. You don't get to communicate back. So, not that I'm bitter or frustrated. I mean, that was, a long time ago. And I only think about it once or twice a day. So one of the things that you would immediately get fired for was climbing the shelves. But the incentives were all set up to handle your problem as quick as you can. And unfortunately, that kind of thing got done by the employees more often than management would have preferred. But that's their fault for setting the system up that way. So you have to be thinking about policies and procedures and thinking about how are people going to behave, and then how do you get them to behave the way that you want. All right, running out of time here. That's long enough on this particular topic. We'll pick up with elements of fire on the next lecture. If you got questions, send them my way. I'll do the best I can to answer. Thanks a lot.